Hello and welcome to the Cinema ATL podcast. The Cinema ATL podcast is a weekly podcast that examines the world of entertainment through the lens of local Atlanta filmmakers. That would be us, your hosts. I'm Michael D. Friedman, and that is
Martin Kelly.
And today we're looking back at a forgotten film by Chris Eyre. This Sundance Award-winning film is called Smoke Signals. But first, before we get into that, Martin, why don't you tell our listeners how they can help out the podcast?
Well, you can help out the podcast by listening like you're doing right now, but also even better is if you, after you listen, if you comment, rate, and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on, and that's anything from Google Podcasts to Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and even Apple Podcasts. We'd appreciate it, and definitely share it with your friends as well.
Yes, and we also want to hear from you. You can always tweet us at CinemaATL or at our personal Twitter accounts. Mine is at CleverTransient.
Or mine is at Marte_Real1.
And then don't forget our Instagram, which is at CinemaATL Podcast, where you can learn about the new episodes and a whole lot more cool, fun stuff.
Definitely. Or always at the legacy website, CinemaATL.com.
All right. So that's enough chit-chat. Let's get into the meat of this episode. We're going to talk about Smoke Signals.
All right, so Smoke Signals. Smoke Signals is a film that stars Adam Beach and Evan Adams. And they play two young men who've been raised on Idaho's poverty-stricken Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation. And they are drawn together when Thomas has to give Victor the money he needs to travel to Phoenix, where his estranged and alcoholic father has died, to collect his things. On the road, they end up reminiscing about a past and clash with strangers. And Victor learns more about his dad from Susie Song, who was his friend at the end. And this film is directed again by Chris Eyre. Again, it stars Adam Beach and Evan Adams. It was written by Sherman Alexie, and this is based off his short story. He started a short story of John Wayne and Tonto fist fight in heaven, but he also put that into a bigger collective called This Is What It Means to Say Phoenix, Arizona. Again, Sherman Alexie has many different novels, and this was his first adaptation to screen. Produced by Larry Estes and Scott Rosenfeld. It also stars Irene Bedard, who's a very accomplished actress and been in many films as a Native American character. Also, fine performance by Gary Farmer and Tentu Cardinal, who's probably most famous for Dances with Wolves, actually. Mm-hmm. Cinematography by Brian Carpenter, edited by Brian Burdan, and music by B.C. Smith. And this film, of course, we talked about already. Sundance, won the Audience Award and went on from there to be picked up by Miramax and distributed widely. And at the time, it was marketed, and I don't know how accurate this really is, but it was marketed as the first film, independent film written and directed and produced by Native Americans. And so that was sort of the tagline. What I'll say about the film is it is a classic. What I love about the film is a classic indie film of that era that we often talk about. A lot of our forgotten films come from that era. Right. It's a road trip movie, classic road trip movie. It's a coming of age story in a lot of ways, and it's a bonding film of friends, right? And it has elements of the Indian reservation life as mm-hmm. well as universal themes. And so ultimately it's a story about the relationships between fathers and son. And I found this film when I first saw it, and then upon my second viewing, not my second viewing, I watched it more than that over the years, but my recent viewing, it still holds up as a very touching film, a touching portrait of a young man who has to come to grips with the legacy of his father and the relationship they had, and doing that against the backdrop of his, marginalized status in the world of the United States as a Native American. So fine performance by Evan Adams for sure. I want to talk about him later. But also Adam Beach, who obviously has gone on to many more films after this. This was his debut,
Right.
but he was very powerful in the film as well. And again, it's just one of those classic films, and the fact that it was depicting underrepresented people just made it all the more special. And it's got humor, it's got heart, and it's just again just a fine piece of filmmaking.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think I think what makes it great is, like you said, it's got universal themes in it, even though it is focusing on a society that often is marginalized and a lot of people don't know a lot about.
Right.
And I think that's one of the best things about the film is that you can watch it and still relate to these characters, but also learn a little bit more about the culture. A lot of people talk about, diversity and learning about other cultures and it, the fact of the matter is that other cultures that are different from your own, people aren't the same as you, and they have different thoughts and backgrounds and motivations that have guided them along their lives. But it's also good to know where the commonality is, and I think this kind of shows in a very intimate portrait of just like anybody, there are these relationship issues that between fathers and sons or between brothers. I mean, these characters in this film aren't brothers, but they're they
They're
grew up
almost
together.
spiritual. They're almost spiritual brothers in a certain way,
Yeah,
for sure. But
these universal themes just gives like a pathway into learning more about a culture that's underrepresented underrepresented on film, and the fact that this was so well received and universally kind of heralded as a success makes you wonder why this didn't start a renaissance of more Native American filmmakers getting that entrance into the mainstream.
well, here's my take on that, just real briefly before we start talking a little bit more about the actual movie. But I think there was a lot of other films, and I actually made it a point to follow this trajectory and watch other films of Native Americans and their stories. And there's been a good amount over the years, but they didn't all resonate like this one did. They weren't, and I think part of it has to do with the fact that Miramax was such a good marketing tool,
Right.
marketing team,
Mm-hmm.
that they could take it and turn these things that weren't as uncommon as they appear to be, and turn them into these events, right? And turn them into. They did similar things with like El Mariachi. You know what I mean?
Right.
And they turned these into little events and exploited it for the commercial value that these little events could be. And there was no commitment after, from Miramax's part to, shepherd any other films like this, unlike, in the case of maybe El Mariachi. And again, I think that's probably a lot to do why we don't know about all the other subsequent films that did come behind this. This just was a trailblazer. There were quite a few other indie films from Native Americans that were quite good, actually, after this, but they didn't come to the same acclaim. And I think it's all to do with the fact that this one may not have either, in which the world would have been poorer for, but it's a lot to do with the fact that Miramax had it in their hands and they're able to do their marketing magic at that, especially in that era.
Right.
And so they were able to turn every odd little film with a twist, with a difference, and turn it into some magic dust. You know what I mean? And that's what I think in terms of the fate of this film and not kicking off like a big wave.
You bring up a very good point about the Miramax marketing machine, and we talk a lot, about some of our favorite films and our forgotten films that we mention a lot are this 90s era, where it did seem like the indie film was king. Like, people talk about like the eras of film. It almost feels to me like the '90s was like an era of independent filmmakers, that is kind of like a forgotten decade of films, right? Like this doesn't exist anymore with these giving these independent filmmakers these voices, and I think it really kind of started with Pulp Fiction becoming such a hit from Miramax, and
Hmm.
they were able to basically everything they touched turned to gold when they were releasing these indie films. So if they happen to bless you with the Miramax logo on your film, you instantly had that clout. Um, and,
Definitely.
and that's not to say that these films weren't worthy of that clout. It's just to say that Miramax did a great job of marketing indie films in the '90s, and we got some great things out of it. And I wish there would be a little bit more of that today. I kind of like A24 is kind of doing that today,
Yes,
but
yes.
yeah, it really did seem like the '90s was kind of a golden age for the indie filmmaker.
It's a lot. I liken it to the early, the early days. Not that early, but the days of hip hop where Def Jam was such a brand that every Def Jam record had to get if you were a hip hop fan,
Right,
and it was a similar for indie film fans. Any movie that had Miramax on it, you had to go see it, and so that's why this movie was able to do as well commercially. But that doesn't take away from how good a film it is, in
right,
my opinion. And
right,
so again, let's get back to talking about the film itself and the fact that it does have a lot of, like I said, a lot of heart and humor, and part of it, is the relationship at the center of it with these two, what I call is as maybe spiritual brothers, but couldn't be more opposite from each other, and so they're having to come to terms with themselves, and their relationship to each other is part of the fun of the film, and also the heart of the film itself.
right. Right. Yeah. You have, Adam Beach is Victor, who's like the almost like a jock. He's like a
Hmm.
basketball player. He seems to be, popular amongst, the people on the res. And then you have Thomas, who is very much nerdy, wears a suit all the time, wears his hair in braids. But he's a storyteller. And, he gets by on words more than looks and athletic ability, and so to have these two come together on this road trip and showing that the different, once again, it's like kind of what I mentioned about just the nature of diversity, and seeing people come together in different ways. It's like it's a microcosm of that. You have these people
Hmm.
that really, they're both impacted by this same person, Victor's father, in different ways.
Correct.
And
Yes.
that common bond is a way to bring them together, but also discuss their differences and discuss what it means to be like Victor says, a true Indian, like,
Right.
you know,
Oh, that's one of the funniest scenes to me is part of that, and I'll give away my favorite line because it just makes me crack up every time. Is Thomas smiles a lot.
right,
He's a very affable young man, and very open, and Victor's obviously completely different in his interaction with the outside world, especially. This is when they're in off the res, and Victor's annoyed with how Thomas acts, and he's like, get stoic. That just cracks me up because he's like, why are you smiling all the time? Get stoic. And because that's how a real Indian has to be. And so it's hilarious, but it does show sort of this idea that they have to deal with not only their own regular lives, but at the same time dealing with the outside world and the perception that the outside world has of them as Native Americans. And so just even through humor, though, it shows you sort of what they're dealing with, and it kind of opens your eyes to this pressure that is on these gentlemen, these young men who are coming to age, in this world. It's really cool. A lot of funny things, but then a lot of poignant things as well.
right. Well, and Victor is like very cognizant of how the outside world views him, whereas Thomas is not, and he has his own ideals and his own beliefs, of who he should be and how he should act. But Victor seems to be more, he comes off as trying to be more world, savvy, but
Right.
really he's not. He's just more uh, pompous about it, right? And so it's ironic that he tries to tell Thomas how to be a true Indian when really Thomas is being more true to himself than Victor is, who's trying to
Right. And
pose
I,
in that
yeah,
way.
definitely. And I think, the fact that, they have two different approaches, and unwittingly, Victor has to sort of come to terms and acknowledge, that Thomas's approach, has a lot of merit to it. And, like I think, the Thomas character, crafts himself as a storyteller, in the tradition of, Native American storytelling.
Right,
And he's always telling other people a story. And it's not necessarily a true story,
right,
but there's truth in it. And that's the point of that brand of storytelling, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be accurate to be true, right? It has to be something that can be understood from a story. And so he's constantly trying to be true through these stories, and I think that's a really cool element of this whole story. And in fairness, the story is technically about Victor and his relationship with his father, but then it's told almost through the eyes of Thomas, and he
well,
becomes sort of
literally
our
it is.
guy.
I mean, he's basically the
Right.
narrator of the film, so like,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, what I love about that character, about the storytelling and the aspect of that is, and they talk about the tradition of storytellers within Native American culture. Um, I love the scene where they're trying to get to the bus to take this trip to Phoenix, and
Yep.
they hitch a ride with two
Right.
ladies who are always driving their car backwards. I guess it's stuck in reverse or something like that. They don't really ever explain it, but it's pretty funny. But yeah, they basically, they say they need a ride, and they're like, "Well, you need to trade us. That we're Indians. We need to trade. You need to barter. What are you going to give us?" And Tom's
Yeah.
like, "How about I tell you a story?" And then he tells this story, this fantastical story that's 100% probably not true, but like
Right.
you said, it does have some power behind it. And then they even like ask, "Is that a true story?" And they're like, "Well, it doesn't really matter. It was a good story. Get in the
Right.
car."
No.
Um,
Exactly.
that's what
Exactly.
I think. I think the Thomas character is what really makes this movie impactful to watch. Without him being in it, there's this kind of narrator of the story. It's not as impactful.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so
And again, this film also, we're talking about it in a conventional sense. It's a road trip movie, and these two young men go on a journey or whatever. But it's actually a little bit of magical realism involved in the story as well. And so, it's very slight, but it's there. Some of the magical realism, and part of that is imbued into the film because of the way Thomas tells these stories. Is like,
right,
there's, some of what he says can't be true, but you accept it, in the vein of the way he delivers it and the way the film is delivered. So, again, it's very deft. And I want to praise, both of those actors for sure, but also Gary Farmer, who
yeah,
plays the father. He's got some very powerful scenes that, if not for those, it would not, the film itself would not resonate as powerfully as it does in those moments. And he, in particular, when he's talking about his son Victor, that's fantastic, a fantastic scene. And again, wonderful performance by Gary Farmer.
when you were talking about the storytelling, and don't want to dismiss the Gary Farmer. Gary Farmer is great in this film. I totally agree with you on that. But you were talking about the storytelling. Something that popped into my head was we just talked recently, a little while back, about our top three Father's Day movies, and one of the movies I enjoyed was Big Fish. Is
Hmm.
very similar in that regard. It's like the stories are not as significant about whether or not they're true, but how the story is told and the meaning behind it are more
Yes.
important than whether or not it's true. And I think that's really imbues mm, this movie with a lot of heart and a lot of um, the way it's told is more important than the actual. Well, not necessarily more important, but it's just as important as the story that they're telling.
True.
And then the
True.
other thing I wanted to bring up was you talked about like this kind of like almost like magical storytelling device. The way the movie's told uh, and the way it's edited also bring that in. I really love the fact that they do flashbacks to when they were younger, and the kids
Hmm.
that play the younger versions of them are like spot on. They're like,
Right.
you got to give up to the casting and to those kid actors because they really kind of imbue the characters with the casting is just great. But I love how they transition between the two. The characters will be it'll be in a scene and it'll like but the camera will move over and then the older version is in the scene, or they'll do some sort of flash cut where the younger kid closes the door and then it's opened by the older version of them. It kind of reminds me of another forgotten film that we talked about,
Yeah, Lone Star.
Lone
Yeah, we talked
Star.
about that,
Yeah,
where some of the characters from the past occupy the same physical space as the
right.
as the as the characters in the so-called present. And yeah, you're right. It does that quite a bit as well. It does a fine job of that, and it really helps the film have this quality that underscores sort of the magical realism elements of it. So yeah, you're right. Absolutely, absolutely. And I know I think we touched on some of the things about the film. It's a coming of age film set obviously in a different world. It's a story that tells relationships between fathers and sons. It does cover an underrepresented community that we don't often see on films. Another road trip movie, a classic indie, like we always talk about. But yeah, so it embodies all those, and I don't want to talk about too much about the plot. We've touched on a few of the things in the plot because I think it's a better discovery if you go into it just cold and watch it.
Right, right. I want to bring up the humor though in it. There's a lot of good humor in it too, and it's humor that comes from the characters and the situation. So it's not like jokes, which is
Right.
what I appreciate. What I really love the way they set up the opening and kind of just show you what's going on the reservation and the life there. And I love the radio station KRES,
Right.
and then the weather, the traffic report that
Traffic
they have,
reporter.
and it's a van that's broken down by the side of the road for like 30 years, and he's
Right.
reporting, and it's like, oh, a big truck just went by, and
Yeah.
then that's about it. That's the traffic, um,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Just little
That
things
kind
like
of
that are
yeah, those
just
little things and
funny.
the small town feel of it really kind of brings you in. Yeah,
Definitely, definitely, definitely endearing. And one thing that this does have in common with one of our other forgotten films, it has Perry Reeves, and so she was getting small parts in these fine indie films back in the day because she plays a small character in this film, and so I noticed that upon my rewatch, and I
and she
hadn't
was in Kicking and Screaming too.
Kicking and Screaming, which is one of our other forgotten films. So,
Great.
she had a good nose for good material actually at the time when she was coming up before
And,
she ever got to Entourage.
and speaking of small parts, actors with bigger roles, Michael Grey Eyes is also in this a very small role at the beginning,
Yep.
and I did. This reminds me again of I previously had brought up like when we talk about we've done episodes where we talk about what we're watching on TV and what's good. To follow up on that, Rutherford Falls on Peacock.
Oh,
Um,
that's right.
he's one of the main characters in that, and he's great in that. He's terrific. And but similarly, I wanted to bring up the fact that it does seem like there hasn't been a lot of American Indian representation, Native American representation on screen. If you're looking for that, check out Rutherford Falls. It's a comedy which focuses on a plot about a Native American culture, and it is half of the writers' room are Native Americans. There's Native American directors on it. It's very fun. I actually, when I first talked about it, I only seen a couple episodes, but I watched the whole run, and it's really entertaining.
Cool.
So
And
I
yeah,
want to check
and
that out.
we just discovered, like, right before we started talking about this, that Chris Eyre is actually going to be a
Right.
director on a new series from J.R.R. Martin
George R. R.
and
Martin, yeah,
George R. R. Martin. Sorry,
and Robert Redford.
or Redford, called Dark Winds, which sounds like a very intriguing
Right.
uh, project. And then don't forget, Taika Waititi has a series coming to FX soon. It's FX or Hulu. Maybe it's Hulu,
Might be
called
FX on Hulu.
yeah, Reservation Dogs, which
Right.
is a play on the Reservoir Dogs, but set on a reservation. So that's kind of cool. And so maybe finally, I know Chris Eyre was actually a little. They had a 20th anniversary screening of this a couple years back, and he was kind of lamenting the fact, like we discussed, that it didn't really kick off this big wave of Native American content, but maybe it's slowly creeping in to the mainstream a little bit. And he mentioned back at the time that Native Americans haven't had their Black Panther moment yet. So
Right.
so he's right. He's right about that. But at the same time, with all these projects that may just start to creep in, and who knows, the fact that all these other formats are starting to gain national attention, or the mainstream attention. Like we just said, a Nat Geo series has garnered Emmy nominations. So these formats could lead to mainstreaming
Right.
of Native American content. So let's hope that happens, because I do agree that it hasn't been a big mainstream phenomenon that it maybe deserved to be, but hopefully that's going to change.
Well, I think things are turning around, and it starts with Hollywood recognizing that they need to actually not just have white people tell these stories, right? And that's what I think is great about Rutherford Falls. That's what I think is great about the Dark Winds. They've said that the writers, it's going to be the crew, cast and crew is all going to be Native Americans. So to get that kind of representation where it's not just about them, but they're actually producing it as well, I think it really shows how Hollywood's kind of changing a little bit. And if you do appreciate that diversity, then you really do need to support these types of things. Um, there's another
Definitely.
show. There's another show out there that I wanted to mention. It's not about Native Americans, but it's a similar concept. Is We Are Lady Parts on Peacock, and I'm sounding like a Peacock ad right now, but
Yeah, I know.
um, again, it's about Muslim
Yes.
women. It's a show
Hmm.
about Muslim women, created by a Muslim woman, starring Muslim women. Like
Right.
but we need to, you need to appreciate those shows and watch them and support them if you want them to continue, because
Definitely.
Hollywood is all about money, and if they
Yeah.
don't see the money at the end of the day, they're going to go back to what they know works, and that's
Right.
white people
Exactly.
calling the shots.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of white people calling the shots, you got to give a little bit of credit. We just talked about him being an executive producer on Dark Winds, but Robert Redford, of course, been a big person behind Sundance, which
Right.
has been a huge supporter of Native American content for many, many years. Their festival has always got a section for those voices to be heard, and so and that's frankly where I always look every year, is to see what kind of discoveries that are coming out of the Native American film piece of that festival. And so this obviously where Smoke Signals came out of as well, in the
Right.
Sundance Institute. So kudos to Robert Redford for being a supportive person in that in
Exactly.
that in that for many years.
All right. Well, I mean, I think we could talk about this for a while, but yeah, I think it's great that we're bringing this up, because I think it's an important thing to talk about. Is like, how do we become more diverse in our thinking, and a lot of it starts with entertainment, right? A lot of people, really focus on entertainment as a way to open their eyes to different things. So this is a great example of a movie that was really embraced for its diversity, and we needed more of that.
No, and definitely, and here's the thing though. But what we've also said about it is its themes are universal and everyone can relate to it. And
Right.
so that's what what I guess has been missing in people's minds is that they think this underrepresented content is not translatable, but it is. It's the human condition. All the humans,
Right.
have similar condition, and the fact that that themes can be universal is why we need to give these stories more opportunity to resonate with the wider audiences.
You said wider audience, right?
I said wider, yes, wider.
No, not whiter.
No, do not cancel this podcast.
Okay, well, I think that's that's enough of our conversation. No, but we really feel like you should, go find Smoke Signals and go find other diverse content and check it out and support it, and you might open your eyes to some new things.
Definitely.
So anyway, that wraps up this episode. Once again, we want to thank Eureka Failure for providing the music as they do for us each and every week. We really appreciate what they do for the podcast. We want to remind you to share and comment wherever you hear about this, and just get the word out there. Let more people know. If you enjoyed this podcast, tell people to watch Smoke Signals and also listen to this podcast and see what they have to think. We would truly appreciate that. Anyway, before we wrap up, Martin, what are your final words of wisdom this week?
Well, this week is coming from an Irish poet named William Butler Yeats, and I liked this, so I want to share it. The world is full of magic things, patiently waiting for your senses to grow sharper.
Yes, like an X-Acto knife. Sharp.
Yes, I think the point is how sharp things need to be. But
exactly, that's the whole point of that quote, right?
Exactly. Sharpen your senses. No, it's to sharpen your senses because
senses, yes.
The world is already full of magical things.
Right. Good points. All right. Once again, we want to thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you again next time on the Cinema ATL podcast. Bye.